Hello and welcome, friends. I hope everybody's having a great day so far. If you are new here, welcome. And if you're back, welcome back. I greatly appreciate all of the ongoing support. This is my channel, Dragonsjewel Creative Gems, and I'm Tegan, and I'm just going to get all that wonderful YouTubey stuff out of the way first. If you haven't hit that subscribe button yet, please consider doing so. It's just down below there. And of course, any love, comments, suggestions, all those wonderful things, there's that comment section down there. And don't forget to hit that like button as well. Today we are going to be doing our Ghostly Echoes series, and we had been going through the province of Alberta. I have now finished up Alberta, and we are moving west to British Columbia, also known as BC. So those will be the next series of ghost stories that we'll be covering starting this episode. We'll see how far we get with those, and I hope you guys enjoy these next few spooky tales. This story takes place in Greenwood, British Columbia. Charlie's Presence. It should not be surprising to discover that museums and art galleries are often haunted. After all, they are caches of artifacts, each piece with its own history. Sometimes, though, it's the history of the building that houses those artifacts that accounts for the museum's haunted status. In Greenwood, a small city west of Grand Forks, in the south of the province, that was certainly the case. The local museum now has its own building, but for the 15 years from 1967 to 1982, it was housed in the haunted old courthouse building. History tells us that in July 1915, a prisoner being kept in the basement cell hanged himself. It is said that the man's restless spirit has roamed the building ever since. Half a century later, his presence was so real to the museum employees who worked with the ghost around that they gave him a name. They called him Charlie. No one on staff had any reason to fear Charlie. His antics were, at worst, merely a nuisance to the living. A certain mannequin, however, was clearly on Charlie's hit list. One day, an employee went to check on the sounds of running water in a supposedly deserted back room. He found the dummy's head floating in a bathtub full of water. After turning off the taps and letting the water out of the tub, the employee dried off the head and reattached it to the mannequin's body. Presuming that the incident was closed, apparently it was not, because some days later, the curator arrived at work to find that the mannequin's head had been knocked off the body. It now lay across the room on the floor, smashed to bits. Charlie's presence was once credited with frightening an employee when she was alone in the building. On this occasion, he smashed an ashtray, and he never did anything like that again. It's possible that he simply didn't approve of smoking. Apart from these antics, the ghost usually made his presence known by simply walking around the building and occasionally thumbing through racks of newspapers. Charlie's earthly life may have been cut short, but it seems that he's making sure that his hereafter lasts for a long time. This story takes place on Vancouver Island, British Columbia. A spirited museum. The pretty Vancouver Island community of Ladysmith, located north of Duncan and south of Nanaimo, is home to the privately operated Black Nugget Museum. According to owner Kurt Gilbride, the building that houses the museum is well over 100 years old. It began life as the Miners' Hotel in what was then a mining boomtown. In that incarnation, the place saw more than its fair share of action, including at least one murder. Perhaps as a result of this lively past, the building is now thought to be haunted. One museum visitor enjoyed a lively conversation with the ghost of an elderly native woman. The guest, who was a spirit channeler, spoke at length with the presence, whose body remains are on an exhibit in the museum. Trinkets that Kurt Gilbride displays facing in one direction are regularly found facing another, even though no one's been near them. In addition, disembodied footsteps are sometimes heard on the staircase. It is not clear that at the Black Nugget Museum, the past has really been brought to life. This story takes place at British Columbia's port. The story of the Sea King. One of British Columbia's most bizarre sea tales began in San Francisco, just after the earthquake in the spring of 1906. The damage caused by the quake and the resulting fires was so severe that no one was ever been able to come up with an accurate count of those killed that spring. During the rebuilding process, tons and tons of twisted and broken materials were hauled to the shipyards and stockpiled. It was intended that the captains of any ships dropping off cargo at the San Francisco Bay Harbor could take as much of the detritus as ballast as was necessary in order to rebalance their vessels before heading out for the next port scheduled on their journey. The Sea King was such a ship. She delivered a load of wood to be used in San Francisco's reconstruction and took on an equal amount of the ballast set aside for that purpose. From her stop in San Francisco, the Sea King steamed north to a British Columbia port where the ballast was unloaded in preparation for the next load of cargo. As the dock workers shoveled the ship's hold out, they were horrified to find bones mixed in among the rubble that had been used to weigh down the Sea King. Many of the bodies of the quake victims had simply disintegrated or become extricably tangled in with the debris that had been supplied as ballast. Those who work on or next to the sea tend to be a superstitious lot at best, so finding human remains from the earthquake scattered throughout the rubble in the hold was more than enough to push most of these men over the edge, even though there had been no untoward happenings during the voyage from San Francisco. Word soon spread that the ship was cursed. As soon as she left port, the sailors swore that they could hear groans and other unexplained noises coming from the hold area. Despite this status as an apparently haunted ship, the Sea King made many more uneventful voyages before being retired to the boneyard. This story takes place in Kamloops, British Columbia. Sagebrush Shades. They call him Albert the Apparition, and his presence in the Sagebrush Theatre in the central British Columbia city of Kamloops has been well documented over the years. The hauntings began in 1939, just after several graves in the Lawrence Street Cemetery were excavated, and the bodies moved to a location on Pleasant Street near the Sagebrush Theatre. Ever since that disruption, the image of a man has been seen frequently. It is presumed to be the spirit of Albert Mallet, the first man ever to be hanged in Kamloops. One of Alberta's favorite haunts is along the catwalk, high above the stage. Theater technicians, people trained to be both observant and analytical, have stared in amazement at a man dressed in old-fashioned clothes who casually stands on the suspended platform. The first time that he was spotted, the worker instigated a search for what she presumed to be a trespasser. Although no one could have left that isolated area without her knowledge, she was not able to find the man. He had vanished. The next time Albert was seen in approximately the same part of the theater, the specter didn't wait to be hunted down. He disappeared before the man's eyes. After the resident phantom was seen sitting in one of the auditorium seats, employee Roger Lance made a bold overture. He went into the seating area of the theater and sat down in that very same spot. As soon as he was comfortably settled, Lance challenged Albert to do something about his live presence in the ghost-preferred chair. Perhaps Roger wouldn't have been so daring if he'd known that in life, Albert Mallet had a reputation for being a mean so-and-so at the best of times, and that he had been executed for having committed a cold-blooded murder. Oddly, the ghost apparently backed down from that particular challenge by Roger. However, judging from the ghostly occurrences during the theater performance later that night, death had perhaps only slightly improved Albert's disposition. No matter what Roger did that evening, he could not get the sound system to cooperate. The levels would not stay set. Sometimes sound would come from the wrong speaker, and sometimes not at all, with the result that cues were missed throughout the entire production. By the end of the evening, Albert had made his point to the daring Roger Lance, who will likely never challenge a spectre again. Though it's easy to see that Albert had an issue to settle with Roger, the ghost's instant dislike for another man, a stagehand is more difficult to explain. Albert's motivation may have been obscure, but his sentiments were certainly made clear to the worker, who was at the time positioned on a platform high above the stage. As the worker concentrated on the job at hand, a bag of peanuts flew at him, narrowly missing hitting his head. Not only was there no human being in the area who might have propelled the missile, but to do such a thing would have been a flagrant disregard for the well-known rules of theater safety. No one associated with the theater would ever have done anything so disrespectful or dangerous. Conversely, Albert's spirit has also been credited with preventing what could have been a serious accident. A woman new to the job of operating the theater spotlights came into work early one evening. She was up on the catwalk practicing lighting changes that would be required of her that night, when a voice chastised her for not wearing the requisite safety harness. Feeling embarrassed at having been found doing something so foolish, she immediately fastened the belt around herself. Seconds later, a light crashed down from above her. Had she not been tied in, the woman would doubtless have met with a terrible accident. Badly shaken, she made her way down to the stage, wanting to thank the person who had given her the timely warning. There was no one else in the theater. Albert has even been known to leave his own particular kind of ghostly gift, an object that appears out of nowhere, and for which there is no rational explanation. A souvenir from an entity is called an apport. The appearance of an apport is a sure sign that there is a spirit around. The apports at the Sagebrush have even been heard as they materialized. When curious staff members went to check on the source of a pinging sound that they heard in the backstage area, they found hundreds of tiny pebbles. Despite their efforts to solve the riddle of the mysterious appearance of these little stones, no one has ever been able to come up with a logical explanation. Usually Albert's attempts to make his presence known are more subtle, but some employees, sensitive to the feeling of being watched by invisible eyes, have actually resigned their positions rather than endured the supernatural encounters. A cleaner who initially announced that she was a skeptic by nature fled the theater after the cord of the vacuum cleaner that she was using continually became unplugged and got tied in knots. Such performances have managed to earn the ghost of Albert Mallet an accepted place in the Kamloops theater community. This story takes place in Michael's, British Columbia. Michael's manifestations. Geological processes have invested the mountains of British Columbia with a cache of precious metals and valuable minerals. Mining those resources have led to the establishment of communities where the miners and sometimes their families can live. But what happens to these towns when the sought-after metals and minerals either run out or become too expensive to profitably mine? Many of those mining towns become ghost towns, some with colorful ghost stories to relate. Michel, near the town of Sparwood, in the southeastern part of the province, is such a place. The lively little town that existed from the 1800s to the 1960s is now a mere shadow of its former self. A haunted hotel is one of the few remaining buildings. Legend has it that during the Great Depression of the 1930s, the owner of the only hotel in town became so fed up with drifters staying in his establishment and then not being able to pay their bills that he actually hanged one non-paying customer. Having paid the ultimate price for his accommodation, George, that poor and punished customer, had decided to stay on at the hotel into eternity. Sometimes George's ghost can still be seen sitting in a chair at the spot in the hallway on the 3rd floor outside where his room once was. At other times, he's more active, causing candles or flashlights carried by warmer-blooded guests to extinguish as they pass the door to his former room. It was probably George's ghost, too, that once would not allow a tourist to make her way down the hall. The phantom just stubbornly refused to let her pass. There is at least one other resident specter on the 3rd floor, making it difficult to always know for sure which ghost is up to what mischief. The second spirit belongs to a woman who killed herself while staying at the hotel. Staff blame her when they heard water running on the 3rd floor. Skeptics should note that a more pragmatic explanation cannot be offered. There is no plumbing on that level of the hotel. Many people think that a number of other spirits reside at the Michel Hotel, but the identities of these additional ghosts are unknown. This story takes place in New Westminster, British Columbia. Haunted restaurants. The Keg restaurant chain is known for its fine beef. Perhaps it's also known for its ghosts. The Keg restaurant in the heart of Toronto is housed in a huge, old, very haunted mansion. The Keg, in historic New Westminster, on the north bank of the Fraser River, a short distance east of Vancouver, is housed in an old train station on Columbia Street. The old train station with the haunted basement. Most members of this restaurant's staff dislike being in the basement. Many simply refuse to go into it alone. Those who are brave enough to do so have been rewarded by hearing their names called out by a phantom voice. About 4 blocks up Columbia Street from the Keg, there's another place where you can count on spirits with your meal. The building that houses the Met Hotel and Restaurant is one of the few in the city to predate the devastating fire that swept the area in 1886. The ghosts that inhabit the place aren't quite that old, but they've haunted the hotel long enough that they are all now thought of as being permanent residents. At least 3 ghosts are in residence at the Met. George is the resident apparition in the restaurant. He appears to be so solid that when people first see him, they are convinced that he is a real person. After he calmly walks through a solid wall, they're understandably less convinced. On the 4th floor, there are 2 apparitions, a man and a woman. They are seen dressed in old-fashioned clothing, their images surrounded by light that gives the entities a white hue. Staff at the hotel enjoy these presences because they seem to infuse the area that they're in with a peaceful feeling. Despite the positive effect that they have on flesh and blood witnesses, the presences seem unaware of today's world. They simply stand near the elevator on the hotel's 4th floor, chatting away to one another. Like the ghost in the basement in New Westminster's Keg, the ghost in the old spaghetti factory in Vancouver's Gastown delights in calling out employees' names in a voice that echoes eerily through the building. This restaurant's unusual decor incorporates a restored old trolley car. Many people maintain that area in and around the vehicle feels haunted, and no doubt it is. There is even a half-century-old photograph on display that shows a shadowy figure sitting in the supposedly empty trolley. Inexplicably, even today, that same shadowy figure is sometimes seen sitting quietly in one of the seats. This story takes place in Victoria, British Columbia. Victoria's Haunted Playhouse. Across the strait from Vancouver, in the capital city of Victoria, there are at least 3 haunted theatres. The Royal Theatre has its supernatural going-ons, and the Langham Court Theatre has its Lady in the Loft in residence. Then there's the McPherson Playhouse at Centennial Square, which has been home to phantoms for many years. One of those, a male ghost, can be easily explained since the theatre has been the site of 2 violent deaths. In the 1920s, a theatre manager hanged himself from the balcony railing, and during the Great Depression, a gambler was murdered just outside the building. Although it is unclear exactly which man's spirit is the active one, it is presumed that one of those 2 tragedies is responsible for the male spectre in the theatre. Accounting for the female apparition is a little more difficult. She's such a delightful theatre presence, though, that where she came from really doesn't matter. Because of the color of her period dress, those associated with the theatre call her the Lady in Grey. She is frequently seen floating about the theatre just above the level of the floor. Occasionally she'll perch high up on the tracks that hold the stage light. Seconds after she's been spotted, this benign entity simply fades away. During a particular difficult production, the ghostly lady did interfere, but perhaps unintentionally. Fittingly, the play on the occasion was about a ghost. Everyone involved agreed that no one should be invited to see the final rehearsal. They wanted the auditorium to be empty of distractions while they went through their roles one last time before the public would see, and hopefully appreciate them. The Lady in Grey, however, disregarded the cast's wishes, or maybe she just didn't know of their needs. In any case, she walked all around the balcony area while the performers were on stage, and at one point she even ran. The male ghost in the McPherson is much more intrusive. He's often heard walking heavily across the stage, while the cast and crew meet in the basement of the otherwise empty theatre. Even though they are heard so frequently, the footsteps are so real and so loud that the people in this haunted theatre inevitably presume that someone's broken in, and they set out to find the trespasser. No one is ever tracked down, nor is there ever any sign that anyone has either come into or left the locked building. In the mid-1990s, Mary McCavan was working as stage manager for a production she was calling the show, giving stage directions from a seat in the cordoned-off balcony. Through the use of an earpiece and a tiny microphone, she was in voice contact with people near the stage at the time. Although she was concentrating on the job at hand, she suddenly realized that she was not alone. There 2 rows behind her sat a formally dressed, pleasant-looking man. Mary called down to the crew below and asked that someone join her immediately. As she waited for her help to arrive, she stared in disbelief at the smiling figure. When the man who she'd summoned opened the balcony door, the entity instantly vanished. Given some of the ghostly antics that have witnessed at the Playhouse over the years, it's reasonable to believe that there are more than just 2 spectres haunting the building. A nighttime security guard once heard someone walking on the fly gallery high above the stage. As the startled man heard the footfalls coming from a place that he knew to be unoccupied, he watched as a single rope in a group of ropes running from the floor of the stage up to the flies above, spun madly. This incident was possibly the work of a former stagehand's spirit. The same security guard also experienced one of the most fascinating ghostly episodes ever to have occurred in McPherson. This one, an auditory one. While on his rounds, he heard party sounds coming from the green room, which is a place for actors to await their on-stage time. Many theaters have a tradition of post-production meetings that take place in the green room. Cast and crew members attending these debriefing sessions can be quite expressive, and the meeting can become quite loud. However, all this racket that was occurring in the wee hours of the night, when the guard was supposedly alone in the building, upon investigation, he found an empty room. Presumably, he had heard just the ghostly residue of a gathering. Understandably, the man was not anxious to work another night shift. This story takes place in Lower Mainland, British Columbia. Enigmatic entity. Ghost stories are often puzzling. The following tale is even more puzzling than many others, because the family involved had been living in their house for nearly 25 years before it temporarily became haunted. Stranger still was the ghost's timing. The entity arrived just after there'd been a death in the family, but it was not the spirit of the family's recently deceased mother who came to haunt the place. Because of the highly personal nature of this tale, the participants have requested that their identities be protected. For this reason, I shall refer to the family as the Millers, and restrict the description of the haunted house's location to merely stating that it is somewhere in British Columbia's Lower Mainland. According to Mr. Miller, the first sign of a paranormal presence in the house came at night, and consisted of a terrifying sound, more like a voice than a noise, and yet it did not sound like a human voice. No one in the family had any idea what they'd heard. They just knew that it was loud enough to wake them up. At first, the frightened group wondered if their small dog could have been making the noises that they'd heard, but they checked on their pet. They found it cowering silently in a corner. They could tell by his behavior that he was as scared of the sound as they were. On the second night, many of the 10 people living in the suddenly haunted house thought that they heard the phantom utter either the word "why" or "die." On the third night, the Miller family moved out of the house, leaving only their dog and a tape recorder behind to hear the ghostly wails. Their experiment was a success. The audio tape recorded quite a cacophony. They recognized their dog's barking, and in addition to that noise, they heard another sound, which they described as sounding like someone in deep agony. These disturbing noises were accompanied by footfalls heavy enough to make glasses resting on a table rattle audibly. Not knowing what else to do, Mr. Miller called a pair of psychics to the house. They told the recently widowed man that they felt a cold presence, like a cold shiver down your spine, like someone trying to grab a hold of you. They saw the ghost of a man whom they described as being a very confused entity, who was in pain. The two sensitives were soon deeply moved by the spirit's torment. In order to accomplish their purpose, they kept praying and imagined themselves surrounded by a protective aura of white light. Over and over again, the psychics urged the lost soul to find his eternal rest. After a full moon, the ghost left, never to return, and the members of the Miller family were able to begin rebuilding their lives. This story takes place in Vancouver, British Columbia. Granville Street's Haunted Stage. In Vancouver, the Vogue Theatre on Granville Street is a striking example of Art Deco styling. It is also extremely haunted. Ghostly activities became noticeable in 1991, when the theatre reopened after many years, a steady decline followed by total abandonment. Perhaps it is true that ghosts likely empty buildings for the amount of paranormal activity displayed, after it had been boarded up for 4 years, was quite incredible. One night, following a full day's work, which included stacking advertising posters in a storage room, the staff carefully locked the building as they left. The next morning, they locked those same bolts and discovered that the posters had been moved from the shelf that they had been placed on and spread about the floor. This ghostly mischief sensitized the employees to the theater's permanent inhabitants. They weren't completely surprised, therefore, to later hear unexplainable noises throughout the building. Even knowing that they worked in a haunted building didn't help them to accept heavy fire doors opening and closing, apparently of their own free will. Those doors are located in the basement where the theater's former technical director, Kenneth St. Pierre, felt an invisible presence brush past him in a corridor. Technician David Ron had a similar encounter under even more disconcerting circumstances. It was summer and brutally hot when he worked on a platform high above the stage. Anxious to get down from his perch, Ron was concentrating only on the job at hand. He was understandably startled when he felt someone brush by him. Just at that moment, the air temperature surrounding him dropped dramatically. Ron immediately looked up, but if the presence had ever been visible, it had already vanished. Operations Manager Bill Ullman suffered that dreadfully uncomfortable sensation that someone was in the room with him, even though he knew that he was alone. He swung around to see who had joined him, and saw only a misty shape by the door. On another occasion, Ullman heard drums being played. He peered around the corner at the stage where the drums were set up, but there was no one there. Although there was one other person in the building at the time, that person was in an office well away from the stage. That night, workers who were securing the buildings for the night also heard the drums being played. Like Ullman, they checked and found no percussionist. Seeing an apparently solid, lifelike apparition standing stage left in the Vogue during a November 1995 show didn't cause veteran performer Shane McPherson to lose his concentration. When the image faded into invisibility before his eyes, however, McPherson was so thrown that he had to cut his dance numbers short. Later in the day, McPherson questions everyone who had been working in the theater during the performance. No one would admit to having seen anything out of the ordinary. The following day, after the performers had taken their last bows and the audience had left the building, technician David Ron had previously only felt the ghost, walked on stage and looked up the production booth. He was surprised to see someone standing there. He was even more surprised when the entity dissolved as he stared at it. When Ron and McPherson compared details about the visions that they had been witness to, it was clear that they'd both seen the same image. No one knows who the ghost may have been when he was alive, but he clearly has an affinity for the Vogue Theatre. This story takes place on Vancouver Island, British Columbia. A ghost known as the Lady in White haunts a rocky shore near the Old Island Highway in the View Royal area just west of Victoria, on southern Vancouver Island. The lady's beloved husband was a sea captain during the 1800s, when shipping was far more dangerous than it is today. While he was away at sea, she often went to stay with her friends, the Calverts, at 4 Mile House, their new inn in View Royal. She died alone and lonely before her husband returned from one of those many trips, and it is said that her watchful spirit is still not at rest. A stained glass likeness of the Lady in White still hangs in the Calverts' former home, a tribute to the poor soul's long and fruitless vigil.